Okay, welcome to APUS History Review, American Revolution. Hopefully you're getting a chance to come to some of the review sessions. If not, at least you've picked up the AP exams, looked at some of the sample questions and practice tests and things like that in preparation for May 15th. All right, so this one we're going to talk about the American Revolution, try and keep it simple, but go over some of the main points for you, okay? It is important, I know we don't want to start you off right away with a date, but it is important to know that the Revolution, right, American Revolution, begins in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War, because that's when the British colonists first start questioning British authority, and really does not end until 1789 when George Washington is sworn in as president. That completes the revolution, which is the overhaul of the American governmental system, breaking from England and establishing a constitution. All right, what we're going to focus on primarily starts here in 1763 with George Grenville's program. George Grenville's the Prime Minister of England, who is responsible for paying off the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, as it was also known. Okay, now, what's his goal? All right, George Grenville's goal is to pay for the defense from the Indians, because as you know, in the French-Indian War, it starts because of a conflict on the frontier in Virginia and Pennsylvania between the British and the Indians over expanding westward. So he has to pay for the defense of the Indians and relieve some of the tax pressure on the British merchants, who are some of the most highly taxed people in the world, not just then, but throughout world history, what the British merchants were paying. Those merchants being people that buy and sell things in the colonies and in England. All right. Now, he has to pay back a debt of 140 million pounds because of the French-Indian War. Before the war, it was 20 million pounds. It's gone up 7 times since then. So we have to pay back this enormous debt from the war. Kind of like the Iraq War, which when it started was about $4 trillion was our debt. Now we're up to 16. But there's other factors in there. But just a little comparison to today. All right. So, the Navigation Acts, so you should know these from your colonial notes. These were passed in the 1730s, so well before the Revolution, forcing the colonists to follow certain trade patterns. All right, remember the rule was that you had to have all trade in British ships, you had to have British crew members on the ships, okay, had to go through certain ports that were British controlled, kind of limiting what the colonists could do. But colonists didn't object to it because the economy was good and there was a lot of benefits for their businesses. Problem was that they were rarely enforced because they were hard to enforce. It's hard to collect the duties and regulate where you were trading and shipping and things like that, okay? Also complicating things was Pontiac's War, Pontiac being a Native American chief. And the Indians were attacking these British forts. So after the French-Indian War is over, Pontiac was kind of still leading some of these revolts and rebellions against the British. Now, the British did not want the colonists to go out there for this exact reason. They didn't want to have to defend them. So the first act, and I'm giving you dates on these only because, as you know, on your DBQs and free responses, they will mark you down if you do not have a sense of chronology. Okay, so chronology is important. So any essay on the Revolution is going to start where you talk about the Proclamation Line of 1763. Okay, this said that colonists could not settle anywhere west of the Allegheny Mountains. Allegheny Mountains right in here. Okay, what they're essentially saying is all the land we got from the French in the French-Indian War, you can't have. Okay, it was the first time Britain was really imposing limitations on the colonists. Limited the power of the land speculators because they were the ones who wanted to go out there and buy the land cheap and then sell it off to prospective settlers. And Britain said you could not do that. Largest land speculators, George Washington and Ben Franklin. All right. Also, during this time, you should know your writs of assistance and fill in the blank, James. Yes, you guessed it, Otis. And this said that the British could search ships with a blanket warrant, a warrant that basically says we can find anything that we're looking for. Okay, they wanted to prevent smuggling. They wanted to prevent colonists not following the Navigation Acts, essentially. Okay, and this is the reason we have the Fourth Amendment now, because now warrants say you have to have probable cause and you have to be looking for something specific. Here, the British could be looking for anything, and if they find anything wrong, they were going to put you in jail. So the writs of assistance was another attempt by the British to limit the rights of the colonists. All right, Sugar Act of 1764. This is not as important as you think. So if you left this out of an essay, you wouldn't be in that big of trouble. But sometimes they might ask you this versus the Stamp Act, which is much more relevant. Okay, here we want to try and prevent smuggling by the colonists, and we're going to reduce the tax on molasses from 6 to 3 pence a gallon. So we're trying to raise money, yet we're cutting our tax in half. But what are we going to do? We're going to enforce the act more thoroughly than was the case before, and if you did not pay the Sugar Act or were caught smuggling, you would be tried in a Vice Admiralty court, which did not have a jury, for one, all right, and you had a admiral in the British Navy as your judge. Okay, so this kind of was the predecessor to the Sixth Amendment to our Constitution, which guarantees you a trial by jury. All right, Sugar Act cost 3,000 pounds. Okay, is what they generated. I'm sorry, it generated 3,000 pounds of revenue. It cost 7,000 to pay for these Vice Admiralty courts and smuggling enforcement agents and things like that. So not too good a job of raising revenue. Which leads us to another act here really quick, was the Quartering Act, 1765. This is a forerunner to the Third Amendment to our Constitution. This said that the state governments or colonial governments in the colonies had to pay for the troops that were going to be housed on the frontier. So Virginia and Pennsylvania and states like that had to, or colonies like that, had to supply money for the troops and supply the housing so they could defend their areas. And colonists didn't want to pay for this, but General Gage said, if you want our protection, you have to pay for it. Okay, now the big one here is the Stamp Act. This will probably make multiple choice and better be in any essay you write about the Revolution. All right, here the goal is to raise 60,000 pounds for the debt. Also required you to pay it in colonial coin, which remember back then was a barter system. There wasn't a lot of coins in circulation, so if you didn't have a lot of the money and you had to pay it for your taxes, you wouldn't have been too happy. Okay, again, if you violated the Stamp Act, you were tried in a Vice Admiralty court. All right, and legally you had to put a stamp on the following. All right, almanacs, wills, marriage licenses, legal documents, playing cards, dice, newspapers. All right, most of these are things that you are not using all that often, okay, but things you kind of need. All right, so the British felt it's a small tax on the playing card, something you're only going to buy once. However, colonists did not have a say in who was going to in this tax at all. It was passed by the Parliament where they did not have a voice, so it outcried the battle cry of no taxation without representation. Okay, it was the first time they had to pay direct money to the British government for small little everyday things. Okay, whereas before they paid their taxes, but they all went to the colonial assemblies, and then the colonial assembly may pay some of that to the British Parliament, but wasn't required by law like it is here. Okay, so the battle cry rings out, no taxation without representation. You definitely need to know the difference between virtual and actual representation. In actual representation, you vote for your representative. You choose someone to represent you in the government. In virtual, okay, Parliament would represent you because you were an Englishman. So Britain's philosophy was, you're an Englishman, we will automatically represent you. You don't choose us, but we represent all of England in their best interest. Okay, but you did not have a vote in virtual representation. In actual, you choose who you were represented. So Britain said, you have representation, it's just this. And the colonists said, we want actual. Okay, so colonists said that Parliament has the authority to regulate trade. They've always done that with the Navigation Act, so they weren't objecting to that. It was the taxation without representation that got them all up in a roar over the Stamp Act. Okay, what was created was a group called the Sons of Liberty. Patrick Henry, Sam Adams were some of the more notables. They would issue threats to stamp collectors. They would give tar and featherings to people. We talked about that in class, if you remember. YouTube it for the John Adams scene if you really want to see something gross. Okay, forced resignations of the stamp collectors. Okay, and the biggest impact it had was the boycott of British goods. We are not going to buy your goods if you're going to have this tax on us. And this put pressure on the merchants, started hurting their line of work. So they would then in turn pressure Parliament and say, these people aren't buying anything from us. You got to lift these taxes so we can start making money again. All right. There was a famous mob riot with the Sons of Liberty where they destroyed Thomas Hutchinson's house. He's the royal governor of Massachusetts. If you're a royal governor, you were appointed by the king. So he was kind of the king's agent here in the colonies, and they took their anger out on him. You may also remember his great grandma, I believe, or grandmother, and that would be Anne Hutchinson, banished from Rhode Island much earlier than this for questioning the church authority in Massachusetts. Okay, and the Stamp Act is repealed a year later due to pressure from the British merchants, as I said before, because they were losing money. So the boycotts and riots and things were successful. All right, so hopefully this helps you understand that. There's going to be a part 2 coming up shortly.